Okay, so um, now I've split off my code into solar system body, troop management, commodities manager. This is the new one that I've in here. Troop management. So the commodities manager, the name, I have a hard time with these names because it needs to be a logical. For me, it needs to be like a logical collection of what's going on. But I kind of want to put the um, the richness and the fertility in here as well, and how that stuff is calculated. But that's not really what commodities are. Commodities are the food. Well, no, they're the thought crystals and other crap that goes on there, and for some expandability and that sort of thing. So that doesn't quite work yet in my mind. So I think you need to change it. I wanted to change the resource manager, but resource manager is like already used for our internal stuff, so I can't use that. So without changing the name of it, I'm doing some other stuff, but I think it'll still be confusing. Some other name besides that. But this is interesting because like this part here, this was a read-only part of Planet previously. The point of making it read-only for this part is to keep other things from changing these values. Shouldn't be changing them. And this is part of what this whole thing of like um, encapsulating or centralizing the code. So I put all the stuff into this, all the commodity stuff into the singular source for this for the planet. So now I should be able to, at some point, be able to merge that with how the freight system does its cargo, and ideally be able to approximate a new cargo class to keep track of the cargo that the trade ships are shipping around. So ideally, what I could do is incorporate that into here, that they're using the same class pieces. Not exactly sure how to plan it out. But right now they're different, right? This is a string and a float dictionary, which means that the string is the name of the commodity, and the float is how much is in it. So it can be like anything, basically, but um, that's fine. But it would be better to use um, a static value like an enum or something like that that has a list of what types of values can go in here. Now the idea of being expandable pretty easily is great. Like using a string, we could just plug in anything in there, and it would you know, it would add to the dictionary and it would work. But the problem, the dictionary would work, and the code that works around it would work. However, the actual functionality of the commodity wouldn't necessarily work because the rest of the game wouldn't know what it was. So it wouldn't ever look for whatever new commodity was put in there until that code was all. But with an enum, the rest of the game can loop through those enums and the values in the enumerations uh, and work on that code. So that should allow adding new commodities to the game much easier. The idea that the commodity contains the code that makes the commodity work, more or less. So that the rest of the game doesn't necessarily need to know how it works. It just needs to know how it interfaces with it and how to make sure the values are getting changed. Technically, that makes adding new commodities and things like that real easy to do. Uh, and if all the code for how it works, like even with like some of the governor AI stuff, is part of this commodity, like the commodity has some information about how the governor can use it then the governor will just look at the commodity, decide if it could use that commodity and be able to do it without having any special code inside the governor. That works great as long as the commodity is affecting things that the governor are about, production and food and research and things like that. It's just a matter of adding those code chunks in that allow it to do other stuff, allow it to access, be able to utilize different kinds of stuff, then having the commodities that will interface with that. That would be great. But to do that, you need a way to logically define it in a different manner, different groups, things like that. But at the moment, the commodities usage is really limited. So maybe I'll leave it like this for now and go back at it later. But I was talking about this dictionary thing, and the idea of having this dictionary be a private dictionary, and here there's like this public I read only dictionary, which points back to this commodities dictionary. So this allows other parts of the code to be able to grab the commodities dictionary that the planet has and be able to look at what it does have and work with it. But it doesn't allow it to change those values. So it can see them, it can see how much is there, but it can't change them directly. In order for it to change it, it has to go through these values, these methods here. And this allows the changing of the commodities to be done in a very specific way. So if some part of the code wants to add goods to it, it has to go through here. And if there's some special code that I need to do when a certain kind of good is being added to it, I can do that here rather than anywhere else in the code. That opens up all kinds of stuff, and I really dig this concept of encapsulating these things. Already I've seen improvements, not just in the way of the code being readable, but in the visualization, the imagination of what that code can do. When it's all spread over the place, it's really hard to imagine how to make stuff work because it's just everywhere. It's so scattered that the visualizing of it is like mind-boggling and very difficult to comprehend. This makes it a hell of a lot easier. So, but the idea is that I need to get, if I want to make that work, I have to get all the commodities into this centralized location and figure out how to make that usable through the rest of the game. That's the tricky part, but I think I'm going to leave this the way it is unless I can find some more commodity pieces and throw it in here. But right now it's really simple. I think that's okay. It has enough lines of code in it that it still meets specifications, and it encapsulates this dictionary so that things can't change it without going through this code, and that's good. I think this will work. So excellent. Now I'm thinking of getting in the planet code. Oh, one more thing I want to go. Yeah, still got it. Where is it? Commodities managers. Here now. For this. Okay, so just look at it for a second. So this calculate consumption. You see now this is where I'm already getting confused, and what my thought process of this is I originally had this resource manager, but see now here this is like doing the food and production calculation for, well, it's doing food calculation. You can see how stupid this is, right? This is what cybernetic does. This is why it complicates the game a lot, right? Just like, you know, this doubles the calculations of everything that's being done because of the way this works. Because here it has a separate consumption code for cybernetic and for non-cybernetic. So, like, the way this is done, this has to be done every time it wants to do something with cybernetic. It has to change the way that it works. It has to have two different ways of making it work. It doesn't have to. It's just that's the way it's built. So, like, to change that, I have to go through and I still have to go through and have some checks based on cybernetic. But what I would like to do is to encapsulate this concept so that it doesn't have to check for cybernetic. It does a trait check, right? And those traits help define what's going on here. I don't know how to describe that. Like the so instead of like looking for cybernetic, it would say Empire, get me the food you need, basically. And they would send back, here's my food resource type, and so find what you have of that resource type, and then do your calculations for how much you used for food, and then send that back. And see, now that's what I'm talking about, because at that point you can start to see some. I can start to see some ideas anyway. Like, well, what if there are different food types? What if there's, one race eats its own population, or um, only eats certain kinds of foods? And at that point, and then that's possible once that concept is made, where it says it's not the code for what kind of food it needs is not here, but in the empire. Once that's done, then each empire can have a completely different food type. And as long as the resources and that sort of thing for that are in there, this code doesn't have to know anything about what kind of food the empire needs. It only asks the empire what kind of food it needs, right? And then the empire can send back the appropriate type, and then this code can process it, and it can do that in a way that it can be very generic, so it doesn't need specifics on what it needs here. It just needs the value, and it just works the value and then sends back the information to the calling method. And that's the kind of thing that this opens up, because otherwise, like this, if I want a different type of food type in here, or a different trait that affects food, that's a new if, right? If else, if else, if else for every single kind. And that's really hard to manage. So if I can get that kind of stuff to work, then it simplifies this whole process of adding new food types, adding new trade types, all that kind of stuff. Just simplifies it tremendously, as long as this code can be generic, and the guts of how it's supposed to work, or at least the details of how it's supposed to work, is someplace else, right? Where that can be defined individually, and even by XML, right? So the Empire XML will have use this type of food, use this type of food, use this type of resource, use this type of thing, for all that kind of stuff. And this code doesn't care what that is; it just needs the values. That's that's what this kind of stuff allows. It just has to be logically figured out how to put it into, or how to make it work. Yeah, and here's like this building commodity. I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but Zero added this in a long time ago for buildings producing commodities and consuming commodities and requiring commodities to work. So the problem with this is like I said, this information for the commodities required and that sort of thing isn't well defined, and that's a problem. So if you say I needed to use the XYZ and that XYZ is not in the game, this is not going to work. Even if it does work, it's not ever going to have that commodity, so it can't ever get it. It won't work correctly. So having these things be a little more strongly typed, or at least being strongly typed for the current game environment. So like the commodities for each, like a separate class, or a class derivative, so that it had a name and had its particular values in it, and those could be defined as part of a mod or something like that. But that's the game environment. Like, this universe, the game needs X, Y, and Z commodities, and those are all defined up front. A different game might have different commodities, and that would be so cool. I mean, the idea of, like, at game start, it generates these commodities randomly, right? So you never know how it's exactly going to work, or seeds the universe with the commodities, so that you may not have certain kinds of commodities in abundance, so that these buildings aren't really that useful to you. Um, or this particular kind of building isn't that useful to you, but some other kind of building is much more useful. And that creates the ideas of you know of that creates real trade, because you have a bunch of commodities that would be very useful to me, but not a lot of some other commodities that would be useful to you, and you want some of them. That's we trade, right? Otherwise, you're just trading production for production or whatever it is, then, and you both have equal amounts of it. What's the point of the trade? Just to do it, I guess, which is good. There has to be some sort of exchange going on where I'm getting some value and you're getting some value. Trade is kind of anyway, getting kind of off track there, but I guess that's the basis of this kind of thing is designed to do, so that that those kinds of concepts can be created. So, in this Planet code, I want to show you the governor code. I'm going to try and work on that pretty soon. There's a whole lot here. This is still 34,000 lines of code, 3,500 lines of code. It was over 5,000, so it's getting reduced. But I want to show you, this is the governing method, right? The governing method is 1,200 lines of code, roughly, right? It's huge. it's it's huge, and that's why working on the governors is so damn hard. Is because this thing is gargantuan, and trying to be able, and it's really badly. The logic on it is horrible. But in order to make this work in a logical sense, and I don't think this is Zero's fault, right? I believe this is the way the decompiler set this up. I could be wrong, but decompilers they interpret the code differently. So I'm pretty sure that I don't think he would have built it this way. This is just maddening, right? He might have. I don't know. In any case, this is like this stuff here, right? All of this specific stuff is in here. So if I wanted to change like um, a minor portion of how this works, I don't even know what this does right off the top of my head. I mean, I can see this dealing with population, but I don't know how it relates to the rest of the code, right? So there's this else here, and there's an else here, and here's the if here. So it's doing some sort of building calculation, figuring out what it can build, right? And so it's looking at these what the building can do. Ah, jeez. But I mean, honestly, like what could happen here is that it has a specific need, and it's looking for buildings that will fill that need, right? Rather than like this stuff here, and it's basically the same concept, right? Because this is trying to fill some need, right? Although it's really generic, right? It's just saying if it's if it has any of these things, oh great, then let's do something with it, right? But it doesn't have a specific need. It's a general, this building is okay sort of need. That seems like a pretty simple concept. But the problem with that is like this is a particular governor type. If I can find it. Okay, yeah. Here, it's a switch for the colony types. This is the core colony, core governor type, and the core governor type by itself is what 300 lines of code. So there's about 300 lines of code for every single governor. So, and they're doing almost exactly the same thing with slightly tweaked values. And this is why this is so hard to work with, because if I want to change the way that this governor thinks about something, but or I want to change something that's going to affect all governors, I have to change that in every single piece of code, every single governor. I'm going to find it in this in these 1,200 lines of code where that piece is. Code is so hard to read and confusing that it makes it really hard to do. So once I can pull this out of the planet and have a governor class, then I can start refactoring those 1,200 lines of code to simplify them to make them easier to understand. Because at this point, I'm not exactly sure how this code affects the rest of the planet. And that's really a problem when trying to work on this stuff, because it breaks things. When if I change something here, I say, well, this looks like a minor change. But when the game is playing, there's something else that's out there that is accessing those values and making decisions based upon them that isn't here. So I can't tell that very easily by looking at this code. So like here's all the references to consumption, right? These are all the different classes that do it. Most of these are probably not that important, but like, you know, these are like some of the screens and things like this. And that's a problem too, is like in the screens, this code is repeated. Some of it is anyway. So it's utilizing something like this one here, right? If this is it's that cybernetic again, right? Net production minus this consumption less than 0, right? This is a screen, right? So this is just information being displayed to you, but it's doing the same calculation here as it does in here someplace. We're doing this consumption. It's probably the same anyway. So if I wanted to change the way that the cybernetic consumption stuff works, I got to change it here. I got to change it there. I got to change it, you know, in each governor, in the screens, in all kinds of places. And that is that's just unmanageable. It's just too hard to do, and that's why trying to work on these governors is just something that is extremely difficult. So like this colony or this empire screen, this shouldn't be doing this calculation. It should be asking the governor class, you know, what this value is. It should be figuring it out itself, in my opinion, because you know if it's in the governor class by itself, then I can change this in one spot and it affects everything. And that is just the beauty of the way that works. All right, rambling on again. I'll go over some other stuff later.